British Academy event. I'm Farhana Hyder. I'm a journalist and broadcaster and a presenter for the BBC World Service programme Witness History, which looks at important events in history through the eyes of the people who were there. Today's event is the sixth in our series called Why History, in which we'll be joined by British Academy Fellows and funded researchers to discuss insights from the past to help us make sense of the present. I am delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Emma Griffin. Emma is a former British Academy Mid-Career Fellow and Professor of Modern History at the University of East Anglia and President of the Royal Historical Society. Emma's research focuses particularly on the social and economic history of Britain during the period 1700 to 1870, with a particular interest in gender history, the Industrial Revolution, and working class life. Emma and I will speak for about 40 minutes before taking a selection of audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit this via the Q&A function. You are, of course, welcome to tweet during the event and can copy in at British Academy, as well as Emma, whose handle is at Emma Griffin Hist. And I'm simply at Farhana Hyder. Emma, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much.
This event is based on your book, Breadwinner, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy, published by Yale last year. I have it right here. It's a fantastic read, really a really great read. So I would highly recommend it. Could you tell us briefly what you mean by an intimate history and why you decided to bring the histories that are usually kept separate, that of the economy and that of women, together?
I'd love to. Thank you very much for the invite. Thank you to the British Academy. I was indeed funded for much of this research through the postdoctoral fellow, and I actually had a mid-career fellowship. I had a postdoctoral fellowship back in the day as well, so I owe a great debt to the British Academy for supporting my research over the years. So why the intimate history? So I've done a lot of work on, or had done a lot of work on, working class experiences of the Industrial Revolution. Most of the sources that I were using were working class autobiographies, and for that period of the Industrial Revolution down to the middle of the 19th century, they were largely written by men, and the records that were written by men didn't tell us very much about home and family. So I carried on with this project. I carried on looking at working class autobiographies, but for the later period, we get a lot more sources written by women and a lot of detail and information about family and home life. Now, that's not traditionally where my interests lie at all. My interests are about living standards and working class life and the kind of the big themes of the kind of social economic change of the 18th century, not really family life and relationships. But I actually found that I could only really make sense of some of those bigger stories that were going on about Victorian Britain by paying attention to the little stories about family life, because the connection between what goes on in people's homes and what goes on in their families and their experience of living standards and their material well-being are actually really tightly connected. So that's where these kind of two, for me, completely unconnected histories actually started. I found it was necessary to knit them together if I was going to make sense of the material that I had in front of me.
Excellent. I mean, it's all the material that you knitted together read so well. Could you say something more about these sources that you mentioned? What kind of people would have written an autobiography?
Okay, so yeah, the autobiographies, I'm looking at working class people, so I'm looking generally at people who are working with their hands and are relatively economically insecure, but that's a very wide range. In our period, this is really a wide range, working class people. So what kind of people write the autobiographies? Well, for the earlier period, if you're looking at the Industrial Revolution or the 18th and 19th century, as I say, they're nearly always written by men. But the other thing that's really distinctive about them is they're written by people who do something in their lives. So although they're born into a working class family, they tend to end up doing something more important. They become a Methodist preacher, or they become a chartist, or a politician, a poet even. And it's because they've kind of travelled this journey that they end up writing their autobiography. So what's absolutely magical about looking at the Victorian period, particularly as we get to the end of the 19th century and the Edwardian period, we get very, very different people writing their autobiographies. And we particularly start to get lots of stories written by people who don't have this kind of rags to riches or this story of achievement embedded in their life history. So I'll just show up a few examples. I mean, there are people like this woman, Daisy Noakes. It's just a very thin little source, just a few pages. She wrote it for her family, not for us. Or here's Louis Stride. Many of these people are born into absolute poverty, and what's really interesting about them is they remain really working class people at the end of their life as well, because by the 1960s, the 1970s, oral history has emerged, social history has emerged, people's history has emerged, history from below. So all sorts of people are now interested in getting the life stories of ordinary people, and so we get really everybody's writing sources. We have the kind of the respectable working class. Dad might be a policeman, for example, and he goes into a fairly respectable working class occupation as well. But we also do get just women really who were born into working class families and end up getting married and raise a family and end up in an old people's home in the 1970s or the 1980s and don't have a kind of a big trajectory to tell about their stories, but we get their life stories are written down as well.
I mean, you look through 600 autobiographies, a phenomenal feat of research. I'm going to ask you a hard question now. Amongst all those autobiographies, I know you showed us a couple there. Did any stand out to you, and why?
Oh, some really stand out. I mean, you really get to know your autobiographers, basically, and you end up picking them off the shelf, and you kind of, yeah, oh, this is Louis, hello Louis again. You kind of feel that you really get to know them, and some of them have fascinating stories to tell. You definitely some write much more on the themes that are interesting and significant to you. Some people will write much more about their working life, for example, and it might be quite a technical account that they're providing, and I'm less interested in that. So sometimes you like them just because they're useful for you as a historian. But I mean, a lot of personality comes through, and you get some people who are just from a very young age, maybe kicking against the pricks, kicking against authority, and have just got lots of spirit. And you do really build a relationship to some of them. And actually, some very heartbreaking stories in there as well. And you feel almost kind of protective and maternal to some of them. So a whole range of emotions, really, that you kind of experience as a historian with these sources. And you definitely get to know and love some of your writers very much.
Fascinating. You mentioned in several of the autobiographers that stories involve errant fathers. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So that wasn't really, I mean, when I came to the project and I came to the idea of working on these later autobiographies for the Victorian period, I wasn't interested in fathers. I wasn't particularly interested in family life. I didn't really have any expectations there. But I noticed over and over a rather similar story that's being told, and it's a story in which the father is either not there, and there could be a host of reasons why the father's not there, or stories in which the father is there, but he's a very kind of problematic figure. Maybe he's not earning very much money, maybe he's not providing for the family, he's not sharing his wages. There are quite a large number of fathers who were very heavy drinkers, and there were a load of problems that are associated with that. Some fathers were unwell. But what all of these stories had in common, and I think the reason people kept coming back to the story about their father, was because a child's well-being is completely mediated, because mothers tend not to work, or if they do work, they're not earning very high wages. Almost all of the money that comes into the household comes in through the labour of the father. So how well the father worked, and how generously he shared his earnings with the family were just really significant for almost all of that is almost the definition of being working class, is there's no other money coming into the household. It all comes in through the labour, the work of the father. So it's a theme that comes back over and over. And in particular, the theme that kept coming back were the problems associated with the father not being there or not providing for the family in some way. So very gradually, this started to shift into the centre of my story. It was not all I kind of expected to find, but these problematic father figures, they just kept turning up over and over again. So I just had to get them further.
And what's the problem that they were talking about? Was that more acute in some areas than others? Can you tell us more about when these problems tended to emerge and what these problems were?
Yes, exactly. Once I kind of recognised that this was a various versions of these stories, the story was being told many times, I just decided to put all of the 600 odd autobiographies into a spreadsheet and just to kind of keep a track of what was going on inside the families. And one of the things I always noted was where the family's living. Are they living out in the countryside? Is that an agricultural labourer? Or are they maybe in the city? If so, what kind of city? Because Manchester is very different from London. What kind of work does the father do? And once I'd done this, it also became really apparent that the problems surrounding fatherhood tended to occur in some situations much more than they did in others. So they were all much more common in urban areas, particularly in big cities. The bigger the city, the bigger the problem in some ways. Very much, and one of the most striking things that was very far from what I would have anticipated, the problems also emerge where there's good, high-paid work available for men, if you like. So the better a man's work earning opportunities, obviously in some of those families, in many of those families, the father goes to work, he earns more than he would have done if he's still out in the countryside where the wages are traditionally very low. He brings it home from his wife, the family is shared, all the family has higher living standards. But it was also precisely in those areas where the wages are good that you also had all the problems that were emerging, all the fathers who aren't working, or who are drinking really heavily, or who aren't sharing their wages, or who are absent. A lot of the fathers, a significant core of the fathers are deserting their families. And all of those problems are emerging in the high wage areas, in the urban areas, and in the industrial areas. And the way I kind of understood this in the end, I mean, these absent fathers and failing fathers had been there as well in my earlier sources, but it's almost as though as soon as male wages become higher, you kind of break down the equilibrium and the stability in the heart of the family. So traditionally, the family has depended on everybody pulling together and doing the very best they can for the family. So the father has to go out and work, and he has to share all his wages. And the mother spends all her time in the fields, in the garden, collecting water, collecting firewood, cooking meals, and it's a joint enterprise and everybody's working together to make the whole thing work. Once male wages become a lot higher, there's this kind of inequality that kind of emerges in the heart of the family, if you like. And I think that's why it was in the high wage areas that the problems emerged.
And Emma, did you end up feeling any sympathy for these men?
Yes and no. I mean, everything that you read is filtered through the eyes of the autobiographers themselves. And some of them, it's really clear, did not like their father, and they are not providing. Yeah, I mean, they provide an account, and obviously it's not a neutral account because it's somebody who was very close to all of this. They provide an account of the father that really does make it difficult to feel warm or sympathetic to the father. They describe domestic violence, heavy drinking, desertion, all sorts of family problems. So on an individual level, no, very often you don't see the father sympathetically. But when you read the same kind of stories over and over and over across lots of different autobiographies, you start to think, well, what's going on here? Why are these problems emerging? And actually, when you look a little bit more closely, you realise that a lot of these men are engaged in very, very heavy labour, very, very long hours, very exhausting work. The wages, I mean, we say they're high and they were rising, but it's still low wages. There's very little time for leisure. The only thing that's available is the pub, and alcohol, as we all know, can be a release. It can help you unwind from a difficult life, and there's a degree of escapism that's going on. It's also very cheap. It's very, very cheap in our period because it's not very heavily taxed. So actually, when you start, once I kind of worked through my feeling of anger towards the collection of men in the autobiographies, I kind of came out the other end, and I started to think that actually there were some really pernicious forces, some larger forces that men are victims to as well. In the level of the family, they certainly have much more power than their wives. They have much more power than their wives because they can earn. They have much more power than their children. So on the individual level, as I say, one doesn't necessarily feel sympathetic, particularly from these sources. But on a population level, you realise, I think, as well, that there's a lot of it's very difficult to be a man in this period. The kind of work that's available is very, very physically draining, and you start to understand why men are finding release in things like alcohol and drinking and the pub.
I mean, you touched on it there briefly, but I mean, do you think we should be worried about the fact that all your evidence derives from autobiographies? Might it be countered that these kind of records would over-exaggerate feckless fathers?
Well, I mean, we all, whatever in history you're doing, you have to think very carefully about the sources that you're looking at and whether there are particular forms of bias in these sources. I mean, I think that's just the bread and butter of being a historian, really. So, yes, I think that's a very serious question. Is there something in the autobiographies that would cause an exaggeration of these problems with the fathers? And I mean, ultimately, I really didn't think there was, and that's not simply because I don't think it would work for my story. I don't think there was because of the way people write their autobiographies. So all of these autobiographies are written long before the emergence of the misery memoir. We think of things like Angela's Ashes, these kinds of stories of the dark, gloomy childhood that make a big splash in the kind of 1990s and the 2000s. This kind of new genre emerges. So my sources are all pre that period. Many of them, things like this, they weren't written for publication. Nobody was writing this in order to make their reputation as a writer or to make some money. They're just hiding away in archives, and they weren't written for that purpose. But the other thing is, it's very clear when you read the writing that the authors themselves are very often trying to say, I shouldn't be telling you this about my father, really. I suppose he had some good points. And then they'll say almost in the next paragraph, I can't remember any good points. But they feel that they shouldn't be saying these bad things about their fathers. I mean, there's one example where the woman says, well, he went off to fight in the First World War. And she says, oh, we missed him, of course. And then before she's even got to the end of the sentence, she's carried on and said, however, it was quite peaceful without him there because he took his drunken ravings away and life was more peaceful in our family. And the money was paid directly to my mother. So we were all actually better off during the period of First World War because the money came directly to us rather than being paid to my father. And yet she's framing all of this as like, oh, we missed him. We loved my dad. He was great, my dad. So even in the records themselves, you see these people aren't trying to regale you with a story of how awful it was. They're trying to hide and trying to forgive, and they're trying to gloss over all the father's failings because, as they say over and over, I shouldn't talk like this, really, because they're still writing in the 1920s or 30s or maybe in the 1960s. People don't want to air their dirty laundry in these sources. And I think that's the thing that's so surprising. Given that they don't want to air their dirty laundry, just how much dirty laundry they are actually airing. And again, I think the reason they're doing that is because you can't talk about your childhood without referring to your father as a breadwinner, because that depends everything. Whether you wear shoes, whether you have food in your belly, whether you stay at school till the age of 10 or till the age of 14, all of these really fundamental things are completely determined by your father's breadwinning. And that's why it keeps turning up in the autobiographies, even though some of them say themselves they don't really want to talk about this kind of thing.
Fascinating. It's really fascinating. So if you were married to a breadwinner, what kind of options were available to you?
Okay, so if you're married to a father, for the mother who's married to a breadwinner who's not providing, well, I mean, your opportunities and your options are really poor. They're really poor. It's very, very difficult. And again, it's why it turns up, because if the father's not providing, the mother really has no option or almost no opportunity to replace that male wage. There's two reasons for that. Partly, houses still require masses and masses of labour, particularly if you're out in the countryside. But even if you're in the towns, you're perhaps collecting, well, certainly in the countryside, you're collecting wood. In the towns, you might be having coal, but you're still making all of those fires from scratch. So every cup of tea, you've got to make a fire. It's quite labour intensive, and you're endlessly cleaning the fires as well. Water is being fetched. Many houses all through my period don't have a water tap inside them, so you're fetching water. There's no refrigeration, so all food has to be cooked from scratch. There's very little pre-processing of food, so the food that you get is very dirty, needs a lot of cleaning before you can wash it. I mean, it's just really, really labour intensive. And to just maintain, you really need you need a lot of unpaid labour, and that's always unpaid female labour. So if a woman hasn't got a breadwinner, she's really in a double bind, because this work still all needs to be done, and yet you still have to find an income. So very often what you'll find mothers doing is trying to send their oldest sons out to work rather than going to work themselves. So you'll try and find somebody who will be a breadwinner for you. Very often women will remarry, because that's a better option. Now, if there's no options there, all a woman can do is go out to work. But of course, it's very difficult running the home and doing the outside work. And as though that isn't bad enough, female pay is absolutely dismal in this period. I mean, if we look at the late 19th century, a woman might earn 10 shillings a week, for example, whereas a son, if she's got a son who's 19 or 20, he'll be on about 20 shillings a week. And a skilled, if you've got a husband who's a skilled worker, he might be on 30 or 40 shillings a week. So you can start to put into perspective, this 10 shillings that a woman can earn is very, very low, very difficult to maintain the household. The other thing that she'll often do, because she can't go out to work, is maybe taking some washing, taking some sewing, and things that she can do from home if she's got particularly young children. But again, all of this is really badly paid. So women's options without a breadwinner are very bleak. They're really very bleak. It's impossible to put a kind of a positive spin really on the life for these women. And some of the autobiographers will even say about a father who was a bad breadwinner, for example, it had been difficult before, but it was even worse when he'd gone, because he usually brought something back, and then when he's gone, there's nothing at all. So
We'll be talking about women and equal pay later on, but did you find any kind of parallels with on the part of the women? I mean, we talked about men not clearly managing to live up to their role as the breadwinner. Were there examples of women failing to provide the care for the families that the families needed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it's definitely the failing fathers is definitely more common. And when I looked at all of my autobiographies, it was about a quarter in the end. So we're not talking about something that's really marginal, 1 in 100, 2 in 100. Almost a quarter are describing a father who's not earning in some ways. So it's a really significant number. The mothers, very interesting what's going on with the mothers. Well, I think firstly, if you've got a father who's absent or who is abusive or drunken in some kind of way, let's be realistic, that puts enormous pressure on a household, and it makes it extremely difficult for a mother to provide good quality care. And it's certainly the case that there are also some mothers who fail in really profound ways. They desert their families. You have some women who are deserters and leave their family, but not very many. When you really put the whole lot together, you've really got quite a large number of fathers who are failing in obvious ways. The number of absent mothers, you don't really have any mothers that are there but not providing them, or very rare for a mother to be there and not providing the meals. So the only really way that she can fail is to kind of take herself away. 5 or maybe 5, 7, 8%, something like that, of absent mothers. So it's really a much smaller number. It's harder for women to go. What you do find, though, is that some of the autobiographers will describe their mothers as being short-tempered, difficult, harsh. There's quite a lot of violence in some of these homes. The men tend to exhibit more violence, but there's a lot of female violence in the homes, and mothers are much closer to their children. They're the ones spending all of the time, all day. They're the ones that are there, and you do get quite a lot of violence from the hands of mothers, and you do definitely get autobiographers that exhibit quite a lot of kind of distress, really, and an upset when they look back on their childhood. So in some ways, these mothers are succeeding. They're putting the meals on the table. They're definitely providing the food. They're paying the rent. The home is there. So kind of the shell of care has been provided, but there's not very much intimacy within that care. And you certainly see that as well. Again, not in the same degree as the criticisms against fathers are more intense and they're more numerous. But I would not try and suggest it was all peaches and cream and that mothers are there as a beacon of love and softness and gentleness. That's really not realistic. These kind of families under stress and under crisis very often.
I mean, we've talked a lot about the work involved in maintaining a family, working for wages, doing the housework, we've mentioned there, but families, of course, are much more than that. What else did you learn in your research, Emma?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I would have thought if I was writing, and I kind of started off actually thinking not about the fathers but looking at the mothers. I just was interested as a relatively new mother. I think at the time that I started, that was just an interesting thing to me. So I was kind of interested in mothering and in care, and yes, and precisely in the kind of the emotions of the family. That's all there. I mean, I think that's really clear that people, that the family is a place of emotional bonds as well. They're much harder, I think, in some ways to unpack using these sources, because even in the 20th century, you'll find that many of the autobiographies don't want to talk very much about how they felt and about kind of the emotions and the love that's within a family. They'll often describe their families in quite clipped terms and quite neutral terms and factual terms, and they won't really go into we obviously imbue the family with so much more love, care, emotion. We think of the family in very different ways. They have a kind of a much more kind of materialistic and kind of realistic sense of what the family is supposed to do, but it is also clear that families provide love and emotion and support. And again, I think it was very clear that when you contrasted the agricultural families, even well into the 20th century, you get this kind of version of the family where from the youngest age, children are starting to do small, useful jobs, cleaning the boots, cleaning the knives from a very, very young age. And then later they're going out doing a bit of work in the garden, and the daughters are helping the mother with the food, and the boys are chopping the wood, and everybody's providing labour for the family. And also the family is the source of friendship and companionship, because you don't have lots of leisure in the countryside. So your family kind of fulfills a lot of your your emotional needs as well. So they've got very functioning units that provide work, provide security and love and safety. And I think when you look at the chaotic 19th century city that's growing really quickly, you find that families are struggling on all these kinds of levels, where you've got this huge division between what men do and what women do, but also the bonds inside the family are kind of weakened as well. So there's it's really so much to say. It's hard to know where to begin and where to stop.
It's also interesting. I mean, what kinds of families are you looking at? Does this account apply to all social stratas? Are you looking at particular sections of society?
Yeah, so my focus has always really been on everyday life of working people, working class people. So I'm not looking at the more comfortable families, and I think we know, in the big scheme of things, we know that in middle class families we've also got a very sharp gender divide between the roles of the mother and the roles of the father. So I think there's a fantastic, there's loads more work to be done there. It's not exactly what I was looking at, because my interests have always really been about how do you keep body and soul together when you haven't really got you've got no material comfort. So I think that's really a lot of what my questions have always been about. It's really about, you know, sustaining life, and so that's kind of forced me to look kind of at working people. But I mean, that's still a very big segment of the population. I'm sure my sources cover a good 80% of the population, really. So it's the working classes, but it goes right up to, you know, the kind of upper levels of the lower middle class, really.
I mean, exactly. I mean, your sources cover 80% of the stories that were being told. And how can we link all this back to our understanding of economic growth during the Victorian period?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, all of this stuff, all of these stories that are being told in the autobiographies, it's all just so fascinating. You could just spend all day just talking about the relationships inside the family and the roles inside the family. There's just so much that's there. But I didn't kind of come in with that set of questions. What I was really interested in is living standards, really. What happens to living standards? What's it like alive in the 19th century? And particularly, I mean, having come out of this work I've been doing on the Industrial Revolution, there's so much debate amongst historians about what happened to working class people during the Industrial Revolution. Did working class people have a better life with the coming of industrialisation? Did it get worse? You know, what was the impact of industrialisation? So loads of debates, loads of anxiety there, and loads of arguments have always been put forward saying that industrialisation was bad news for working people. When we move into the Victorian period, all of that kind of angst that historians has melts away, and the story that historians have always told us is that, well, you know, prosperity is a prosperous nation, we're getting more prosperous, and living standards start to rise all through the 19th century. And there's really been kind of no debate around those that kind of story of prosperity. And I think it was just because it was so very jarring. I mean, particularly a source like this, for example. I mean, she lives in Bath. This is Louise Stride. She lives in Bath, which is a wealthy city, growing even wealthier during the 19th century. And she's picking food. You know, in the Edwardian period, she's picking food out of the gutter to eat because she's not getting fed properly at home. So there's just this huge mismatch between this story of prosperity and actually what I was reading in the autobiographies, where things didn't look prosperous at all. And I suppose I came to the realization that the way of bridging these two narratives is to think about what actually is going on inside the family. And yeah, I suppose that's how it came together.
It's really interesting, so fascinating. So if we bring it now, before we go to questions in not very long, in your documentary, Mind the Pay Gap, which aired on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, you took a historical look at the gender pay gap from the 15th century up to the present day to understand why it's still an issue today. Could you talk about some of that, the many different explanations that you encountered in your research?
Yes, really interesting. I think so. I mean, obviously, the gender pay gap hasn't gone away today, and it became quite big news a couple of years ago when that amendment to insist that large firms report the gender pay gap was enacted. So, in some ways, that's always been present, and I've always been kind of thinking about working class people and men and women, and it seemed to make a lot of sense to try and think about what's going on there. And I think the thing for me, what's come out of all of my work really on industrialization and living standards and gender is that particularly in our period, but even today, it hasn't gone away, all humans need some kind of labor just to keep body and soul together. Even if it's today and it's just a question of going out to the kitchen and putting a pizza in the oven, you've still got to go to the shops, you've still got to have a home, you've still got to have plates that's all going to need washing up. And of course, as soon as you bring children into the mix, this labour is massively increased. 2-year-olds are not going to cook their own dinner and they're not going to put themselves to bed. So there's just a need for labour. And in the Victorian period that I'm familiar with, that problem was squared, and in earlier periods as well. The problem is squared is by just making sure that women's wages are kept really low. Because you see this throughout the Victorian period, where the factories emerge and women start rushing into the factories and start working, and they earn quite good wages. They don't want to get married and have lots of children. So how do you square that? How do you make sure that every family has some unpaid domestic labour available? And from my perspective, the way that you make sure that works at the social level is to just make sure that wages aren't high outside the home. Because as soon as women have access to high-paid labour, well-paid labour, they leave their families, they leave domesticity, and they start working instead. So you see really clearly that the low pay is really a mechanism to make sure that every family has some domestic labour. And I don't think that problem has gone away, because our families today still need labour, and particularly families with children. They always need a lot of labour from the parents and a lot of wraparound care. And how do you make sure that families have this wraparound care? Well, you know, if you've got a couple and one partner earns more than the other, that kind of, you know, that kind of solves that problem, doesn't it, as to who's the to work and who's the one that provides the labour. So I think really the histories of what goes on in the home and the history of what goes on in the workplace are really, really interconnected. And I think we've often thought about the gender pay gap. We think about it as a business problem. We think that if businesses and employers can get their act together, they'll be able to solve the problem. But I think what I've come to realise is not actually just on businesses. It's about families. It's about all of us. It's about something much bigger. It's a much bigger social force, and it's as much to do with what goes on in people's homes, which is very difficult, probably very undesirable to legislate against. But it's about what goes on in people's homes as much as it is about what goes on in the workplace.
And what do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has done to women's progress, to women's economic progress?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it doesn't look as though it's been very positive to women's economic progress. I mean, I suppose to a degree we need to sit this out and see what happens over the short to medium term. But I think, I mean, what has been very clear, particularly with the closure of schools, I mean, I think it's it's that classic problem. Once the schools closed, there was a need for more domestic labour, whatever you describe it. There was need for work inside the home. And we already know quite well that in many households, it was the mother and the woman that picked this up. So I think there's a lot to see. I mean, on the positive, maybe it helps us to have a debate. I mean, the lockdowns are over, the children are back in school. Maybe it's a reminder that we need to carry on thinking about what goes on in people's homes, how domestic work inside our private lives is dealt with, because we can't really enter a new kind of more equal world unless we crack this nut inside the heart of our very own families and our very own households about how we share out domestic work.
I've got lots of interesting questions coming in, Emma, but before we go to that, finally, can you tell us what you are planning, where you are planning to take your research next?
Well, I had kind of towards the end of this, I'd signed up to a project that took me back to what I'd been working on before in the Industrial Revolution. So I'm actually currently working on industrialization, but I'm trying to think about what is an industrial revolution, and I'm trying to think about it from a global perspective as well. So it's quite a big shift away from the micro stories of the autobiographies. I've suddenly gone to a massively big canvas. It's the whole globe. And the question is, what is an industrial revolution, and why does it happen in Britain, first of all, and why does it then spread where it does spread, and why do some parts of the world, others are left behind? So a very different kind of canvas. But I think in my heart as well, I would like to, at some point, I did working class autobiographies in the Industrial Revolution, I've done the Victorians, and I think before I retire out of this profession altogether, I'd love to do something about women in the 20th century, autobiographies and women in the 20th century. That's down the line. I'm not even starting on that yet.
Well, I'd love to read it when you finally get to it. Thank you so much, Emma. Let's go to some questions now. So, Emma, Morticia is asking, how were these autobiographies published? Who was their target audience? And were they intended primarily for family or for wider audience?
Lovely. So it depends on the autobiography. So all through my period, you still have books that are, I've got any particular close to hand? No, because I'm not in my office, I'm at home, they're all up at work. Lots that are written by people who've done something. Still unionists, for example, politicians, and they are written to be published. So those are still being written. Those are still the kind of the big autobiographies by people who did something with their life. You've definitely got those published autobiographies. In addition, you have a large number that are just written for family. a lot that are written for family. There's a wonderful collection of autobiographies that were mostly written for family that have been deposited at the university, Brunel University. Some researchers there, they put a call out on Woman's Hour in the 1960s saying, have you got anything like this, or do you want to write your own autobiography? As there's a lovely collection there, and many are being written for family. Some of them are hoping their autobiography will be written, that very often will be published, but often it doesn't get published. And then you've got publishers, I mean, lots of little publishers like this, for example. I mean, it's almost just, I don't know if you can see, how can I do this? There we go. It's almost just a staple, you know, a photocopied, stapled together. So you get some kind of local history, very kind of prestigious publishing, if you will, that's emerging. So you know, people have a whole range of motivations for writing their autobiography, basically, and they appear in different places. They can be glossy published books that sell for £20, or it could just be a pamphlet, or it could just be papers that are sitting in an archive somewhere now.
Excellent. David is asking, do you get a sense of what happened to elderly parents from these autobiographies? For example, did older men tend to enter the White House more frequently than older women, on the grounds that as an errant fathers they would be more distant from their children, and so in later life would be less welcome as part of a multi-generational household, and therefore more reliant on institutional forms of assistance? Really interesting.
That is interesting. I don't have enough. Well, I mean, firstly, people don't say an awful lot about older parents. So the narrative arc of an autobiography tends to be a lot about childhood and a lot about the parenting that was received in one's early years down to about 19 or 20. Then, particularly with the male autobiographies, they'll leave the family home at some point in their teens. And then very often they won't mention their parents again. You don't even know actually when or where the parents die, because they've just moved on to other things, their working life, their marriage, their children. They don't say very much because people aren't living in multi-generational households mostly. They don't say very much. The female writers are much more likely to remain in touch with their mothers, and mothers are more likely to be mentioned. As the life story progresses, but still, I would say there's not unlike the fathers and childhood, where you've got a really kind of rich evidence base contained in the autobiographies. You don't have a rich and consistent evidence base for what's happening with elderly parents. And also for me, I mean, it was just a problem that I was stopping in 1914. But a lot of the autobiographers' parents would not be growing old until the 1930s, for example. So they've just actually moved outside the chronology that I was working with. So difficult for me to say.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Alexandra is asking, are these types of sources, i.e. the voice of the lower class, also available for the Georgian era? I mean, would you know that?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Really good question. So I think one of the things that's interesting about autobiographies is you get more and more as you go on. You do get people who were born in the 18th century, even in the very early 18th century, who end up writing their autobiography, but it's really rare, because the only thing that's going to enable that person to write an autobiography usually, or it's only going to have survived if it was published, and it's only going to be published if that person did something that's kind of super significant in some way. So you do, and they're still hugely interesting, because these people have often been born into abject poverty. So there's an awful lot about being a child in a poor family in the 18th century that you can get out of them, but you tend to find, well, you've got much fewer. I mean, you've certainly got much fewer. You haven't got a lot. And this culture of writing of autobiography doesn't really belong in the 18th century. It belongs in the 19th century. It's with the emergence of the cities. It's the emergence with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, the Chartist movement, all these kinds of more modern developments. These are all tied in with the writing of autobiographies. So although they do exist for earlier periods, they tended to be very exceptional. You were very exceptional if you wrote an autobiography in the Georgian period. But as we kind of head on into the Victorian period, it becomes something that's much more normalised, and certainly by the Edwardian period, then far more normalised yet again.
I mean, we're getting so many excellent questions coming in. So I'll try and rattle through them. Which work have you encountered where race and racialization are clearly determining how the autobiographers represent their lives? Another really interesting question.
Very interesting. So, I mean, I have, for my period, there are very few certainly very few autobiographies that are written by people who aren't white, and very few autobiographies that even mention non-white communities. That's not entirely the case. I've got one who's got a Turkish father, for example. I've got another one who's got a best friend whose father is black. So it turns up, but not very much. And these are kind of dot communities. These are dot communities that's like slightly more racially mixed. The major exception to that is the Irish. So all the way through. I mean, that's the immigrant group that's really significant and really substantial. Lots of sources written by the Irish. I don't think they write about their experiences. I mean, they've often got very distinct experiences. They're often very poor, and that's very clear. And mothers and fathers are often behaving in slightly different ways. They've got a slightly different culture of the family, and much more of a tradition of female work, actually. So you've got far less likely to have the mother at home simply doing domestic work. The Irish families, you very often have the mother doing some kind of work as well, but they're not viewing themselves, they're not writing a racial history, they're not racializing their history, they don't understand themselves as racially different from the people that they're living with. They consider themselves to have been Irish, and they think this is different. The story is different in some ways. They're very often positive about their relationship and their history with Ireland. They're very proud of their connections to Ireland. If you've got a family where some are born in Ireland and some are later born in England, there's a lot of pride in having been one of the Irish born. There's a lot of interest in that, but I don't think race is quite the right lens to understand how they're talking and understanding themselves.
Okay. So Emma, Jane is asking, I am interested in the phenomenon of working class charity and those who have so little often contributing to charitable causes, even in a small way, via religious giving, hospital funds, other collections. Is it difficult to find evidence of this in a systemic way? Can you say anything about this theme, and if it was apparent in the autobiographies in your study?
Yes, I would say not very apparent in terms of giving to charity. Definitely not, because all through my period, people have very, very low incomes. There's very, very little money to spare. Even in my better off families, I often use the example of the egg. Eating an egg is something that's talked about very often in the autobiographies. If you live out in the countryside and you've got chickens, you might eat eggs fairly regularly. But very often, even then, you won't. And if you do have eggs, you'll be selling them, you won't be eating them. And certainly, if you live in the urban areas, you, as a child, will very rarely eat an egg. It's a huge treat to eat an egg. Eggs aren't particularly expensive, by the way. An egg is an egg. I'm talking about the same thing that you think I'm talking about. It's just an egg. And yet these families don't really have money to give eggs to feed their children. So they're not really giving very much money to charity. How charity emerges is particularly in the end of by the end of the century, you've got churches providing things like free school dinners, soup kitchens. There's quite a lot of food and cooked meals that are being distributed to people in urban areas where you've got the fathers that aren't providing. You basically get charity starting to step in, and they do so not by giving money, because that's a very it's anathema to the kind of the politics of this period. They do so by giving cooked food out. So some of my autobiographers are recipients of charity, and I think there's a giving in terms of helping with one's neighbour, but formalised charity is not something that I've got much evidence of my kind of autobiographers being involved in on the giving side, much more on the recipient side.
Okay. Interesting. Anna asks, Emma, do you think that contemporary, mostly middle class novelists accurately captured the reality of working class lives?
No, I don't. I think if you want to really think about working class lives, you're much better off reading records that have been written by working class people. Very often, there's always a problem. My sources are often not written at the period, because these autobiographies are often written 50 or 60 years later. So I'm not saying this is the perfect source to go to, but there are problems with all sources, and I'm a great believer of trying, if you can, it's not always possible, but if there are sources available written by the people and produced and created by the people you want to study, they should definitely be your first port of call. You definitely want to try and get those sources first. So I think that's very much been my approach. Novels, I mean, the novels, there are things they do get right. I mean, I don't want to say there's absolutely nothing they get right. Of course, there's lots that they get right. I mean, you think of some of the Dickens novels. I mean, some of these the big themes of his stories are completely spot on. Absolutely so. But I want to temper that. If my question was, what was life like for the working class people, rather than how were they perceived, I definitely want to try and look at some sources that have been created by them.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you've gone through 600 first-hand sources. How difficult was it to find them, actually? I don't think, did we have we touched on that? Probably not. I mean, how hard was it, Emma, to find all those autobiographies?
Well, I owe a big debt. Like all historians, you owe a debt to what people before you have done. So a lot of work was done by David Vincent and by John Burnett and David Mayall in the 1970s and the 1980s. They tried to create a list of all the autobiographies that are there, and that was my starting point. So there was a really a good way of getting in was just to take this book, they put them all into a published book, just to work through the book and find what's there. But actually they're abundant. Certainly as we get into the later period, there's abundant. I could go to any local studies, like back in the days when we used to get out of our offices and out of our houses, I could go to any local studies library in any town and just browse the shelves, and I would be likely to find a few recollections written by somebody, might be in Bedford or wherever it was, by some person who'd been born in this town and was writing their recollections. That is nobody really knows they exist. So it was almost the opposite. At some point, it's like, well, I have to stop now. Enough stories. I could carry on going around towns, and I could go around finding more sources of this kind, but I need to stop and I need to write the book now. So there's really, certainly as we get to the 20th century, there's an abundance.
Okay, so Randy is asking, not sure what the numbers are like in Britain, but in my country, the unpaid labour at home has become far more equal between genders in the past decades, thanks to affordable childcare, mandatory parental leave, and for fathers, etc. Have you seen similar trends in British history throughout the 20th century?
Yeah, well, I think it was very, for my period down to the 1940s, is very divided. If we go back to the 18th century, as I say, there's a kind of equality, though there are always male tasks and female tasks, but they're both equally important. So the women are nearly always doing the food, always doing the cooking, always looking after the little children. So there's never kind of men and women aren't doing the same tasks, but there's a kind of equal value to all of the tasks. And I guess a lot of my period during the 19th and well into the 20th century as well is this kind of splitting out and really consolidating these differences and according a different set of values. So I think that's a big story of the 19th and 20th century. That idea of men and women doing different things is very old, but the idea of them having very different values is new and is more modern. I don't think we see a great deal of change in that until we kind of enter the post-war period in the 1970s. About the 1970s, I mean, certainly fathers are becoming more involved in their children all through the 20th century, but modestly so and slowly so. And in the kind of the 1970s, the 1980s, these trends start to accelerate. I would also agree that over the last decade, as Randy's mentioning, I don't know which country he's referring to, I mean, there's definitely ongoing and rapid progress. And I think more recently, the government has introduced the shared paternal leave so that fathers can actually spend time at home with very young children on their own. And some fathers are taking this up, not all. It's not available for all, for various reasons. So I think we're seeing changes, but they're quite slow and they're very much late. For me, I think these are very much late 20th century and 21st century developments.
Yeah, much closer to now. Tan, Emma says, you mentioned about the sons in working class. Did you come across any autobiographies that mention anything about the daughters?
Oh yes. So all the 20th, the kind of the later autobiographies, about not quite half, but 40% of them are written by women. So, and about 60% are written by men. So they all have this story. They're little children, they go to school, and then they kind of start to make that transition from school to adulthood. So the men always write this story about getting the first job, and then all through their teens, they're getting more and more jobs, and they're earning more and more, and then eventually they're independent, they can leave the family, and they go and live their own life, and that's their narrative, that's the narrative arc of their stories. The women most certainly tell a kind of similar story about leaving school and starting the journey to adulthood, but they're much less likely to go to paid work. So at the point that their schooling ends, very often they're mothers saying, right, you're at home now, you're going to help me with all this domestic labour. They do some work, but they start work later. And very often then they might be pulled out of work, so they might go and work for a bit, and then mother maybe will have another baby and just say, right, I need you at home. Say the daughter stops working. So a lot of what the daughters are doing through their teenage years are actually learning how to look after a home. They're learning how to cook, they're learning how to budget, they're learning how to clean, they're learning how to run a home, basically, or still very labour intensive. Some of them are working, and in the factory districts there's a big difference. In the factory districts they have the same story. They start working, then they start earning more and more and more, and by the time they're in their late 20s they're earning quite good money, and they can be independent of their family if they like. But almost all of the other women who are not in factory districts have this very kind of troubled and protracted adolescent where they can't really get free of their families, because even if they go to work, they're only going to be able to earn about, I mean, some of them will even say this, if they've got difficult home lives, they can only earn about 5 or 6 shillings a week. You can't live on 5 or 6 shillings a week. You can't pay for rent, food. You are not independent. You cannot leave home. You can only work if your parents are prepared to support you in that. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And it's very difficult. So you certainly lots of stories, but very, very different stories for the girls.
We're nearly running out of time. I'll try and squeeze in a couple of more questions. So Kathy asks, how much is dependent on the people being able to read or write?
That's significant, I think, highly significant for the earlier period, the Industrial Revolution. That is a limiting force, definitely. In the 20th century, much less. You've got compulsory schooling from about 1880. So for your kind of Edwardian generation, they've mostly learned to read and write. But you also find that you can have, I mean, some of the autobiographies are kind of written down by a granddaughter, for example. And so if an elderly person can't write, they'll have a scribe or a family member who will actually do the writing. So as we move on in time, that force, which is very significant for the 18th century, for example, has really ceased to be very significant by the early 20th century, or far less so.
Probably one more question and then we'll have to leave it. But Lynn is asking, did you follow up on any of the families in the census? So basically follow up after the autobiographies ended, what happened next?
Oh yes, I loved it. It was one of the most fun things about the whole project, was actually very often trying to find them in the census, and sometimes checking out little details of the story. So sometimes they're a little bit vague, for example, about when their parents had got married and when they were born, and you can kind of go back and you can look at the dates. So you might realise the child has been born illegitimately, or had obviously been conceived before marriage, or other little things that have been edited out of their history. Or they might be kind of vague about the presence or not of the father, and then you look at the census and you can see either he is there or sometimes he's not there. So yes, I did a lot of checking, sometimes just out of curiosity, sometimes to fact check, to get additional information, but I think if there are any family historians in the audience as well, it's just addictive. So sometimes just because it's just really fun.
Emma, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. Thank you for joining us and for answering all our questions. I'd like to also thank the audience for some fascinating questions. Do make sure you join us again for the next event in the Why History series. And that's on Thursday, the 15th of April, with the British Academy Fellow, Professor Rebecca Earle. Details are available on the British Academy website. Emma, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us.